How do you do, fellow Magic the Gathering arena players? I'm Amy the Amazonian, and I'm here bringing you breaking news about Alchemy. That's right, it's the format you either love it, you hate it, or you don't even know about it. But if you play it, then you're probably going to be interested in these rebalances. Also, I'm going to say it, there's one piece of information in this entire video that is relevant to historic players. Is it Teferi is being unbanned. Everything else you can pretty much ignore. I'm going to talk about that at the end because we're going to go through the cards that are being rebalanced. So Alchemy first came out on December 9th, I believe, in 2021. It is now January 26th, 2022, a little bit over a month into the format's existence, and they are finally rebalancing cards, but they're not really rebalancing the cards that people thought they would. These go into effect tomorrow, as of me recording this video, and I guess they just want to make some of the archetypes that aren't so strong more playable. And when I say archetypes, I mean archetype. The most important thing in this entire article is what didn't get touched. None of the cards with spellbooks were rebalanced. None of the spellbooks were rebalanced. There were no additional changes to make one of my favorite pieces, Party, more playable. Aw, Base Camp, I'm so sorry. Base Camp, you deserve so much better than this. So, this is the great first Alchemy rebalancing, making Magic the Gathering Arena even weirder and more different from paper Magic. If you're not familiar with what Alchemy is, imagine if you took Standard, you added a bunch of cards to it, and then you rebalance those cards because they're not actually printed into paper. This is a digital-only format. I have a whole video about Alchemy. If you want to check it out, it is on my channel. So, what cards are being affected? I'm going to tell you right now, it's dungeons. It's Venture into the Dungeon. So Venture into the Dungeon, when it came out in Adventures in a Forgotten Realm, was not very strong, and it continued to be not very strong. There are some decks, and you can definitely get wins with them. I've definitely gotten some wins with them. Back when I made videos with Channel Fireball, I made a jank tank that was black-white Venture into the Dungeon. And the cards that they affected are Black-White Enter the Dungeon card. So venturing into the dungeon is the mechanic that lets you traverse through and get some extra little goodies along the way as you adventure through the dungeon. It's usually stapled onto well-statted cards, not amazingly well-statted cards, and a lot of cards will actually give you bonuses and benefits if you have completed either a dungeon, any dungeon, or a specific dungeon like Acererak does. So let's talk about each of these adjustments, and I'm going to lament the fact that they did not change Key to the Archives because that makes me very upset. So, what cards did they impact? Acererak! Hey, Acererak! They made it so Acererak does not have the choice when it attacks in of your opponent sacrificing a creature. Now, Acererak just kind of makes a 2/2 zombie and attacks in. Cool, alright, great. That's pretty inconsequential, I think. I actually am not really sure if this is a buff or not. Giving your opponent the choice of sacrificing a creature can kind of get some big brain plays going on, like, oh, and now a creature left the battlefield, and we're going to punish you for doing that because if a creature left, we get this revolt trigger in Historic or something like that. Not too interesting. Assemble from Parts. This one is actually not a dungeon card. This was an Alchemy original card that got rebalanced. Assemble from Parts now costs less. So the goal here is that on turn 1 or 2, you get a creature into your graveyard, and then you cast Assemble from Parts, which allows you to then resummon a 4/4 zombie version of that creature from your graveyard. So they made it so it only costs 3 mana, so you can get this off earlier or use it with other Entomb effects. I don't know if this will ever see any play in Historic. It doesn't see much play in Standard right now, but it is a kind of fun, janky card as like a way around reanimation that's sort of like, you know, using the Scarab God to make these zombies. Very fun. Happy to see it adjusted just so more people will play it. Blood Rage Alpha was a 4/4, or is a 4/4, was a 4/3. This card is one that makes your other wolves fight. It itself does not fight unless you have another Blood Rage Alpha, so I think that the additional 1 toughness was just kind of, hey, you know, maybe these wolves need a slightly better stat boost and are not trading into 3/1 flyers like Elite Spellbinder, or 3 ones on the ground that cost 2 mana. Yeah, 3 toughness is really awkward in Magic, even in a format that doesn't have bolts. This is the kind of card I would really only include maybe 1 or 2 of in a werewolves deck, and werewolves are very strong in Alchemy. So this to me seems like a pretty inconsequential change, but I am happy that they're trying to do more of these changes. So Cloister Gargoyle. Now we're getting back into the dungeon stuff. This one's actually really big. Cloister Gargoyle was an 0-4, now it's an 0-3, and it only costs 2 mana. This is a cheap and easy flyer. It's going to become, assuming you complete a dungeon, a 3/3 flyer for 2 mana. That's good stats. That's good stats right there. And anything that enters the battlefield and ventures into the dungeon is pretty good. I did find myself sometimes playing Cloister Gargoyle in my decks, and seeing an uncommon get balanced to be a little bit better makes me happy because it's a good card and it, you know, can be a little bit better. Sometimes it's just a blocker. Sometimes it's a threat. I kind of like that modality when it comes to dungeons. Oh, and now, one of the most embarrassing cards, one of the ones that when you saw it in a draft, you felt, oh, really? Really? Has been rebalanced to be slightly better. Unfortunately, he's not impacted in drafts itself, but I think that this could mean that this deck, or this card will see more play in Historic Brawl specifically, and in Venture into the Dungeon decks. Dungeon Descent originally came in tapped, and cost 4 mana to activate. What the heck? It also has the requirement of, like, tapping an untapped legendary creature in addition to it, and it's also sorcery speed. It's still not good, and it's still weird as a rare, but it's funny that they had to add this much rebalancing to at least make it not awful. Hey, having a colorless mana source that might not be doing anything on a given turn, that's not the worst. The fact that it came in tapped, though, was, like, such insult to injury, like, oh, I'm not even allowed to use this bad Venture into the Dungeon card as mana on the turn it comes in. I'm never putting this into a deck. Now, I might. I feel like it could be a really fun, like, one-of include in my Brawl Gruul Legendaries deck. Still not good, but at least it's better. Now, oh my gosh, look, it's Ellie Wick. She's just like me. She's so happy, and now she's slightly better. So they made it so Ellie Wick's ult is a -6 instead of a -7, so you can get it off in 3 turns rather than 4. Ellie Wick still kind of stinks, though. She's 4 mana. Her plus is just Venture into the Dungeon, which isn't that good, especially because green doesn't have that much good Venture into the Dungeon cards. What it does have is it does have Varus, I think is his name. He's the elf, or half-elf, with reach. He's a 3/3. Not awful, not great. And the Bard, the Wandering Troubadour, which is a 4 mana card. So you kind of have this concentration at 3 and 4 mana of these green Venture into the Dungeon spells. There's a couple others. You'll actually see one gets rebalanced down below. I'm glad that they made her better, but I don't know. Maybe +1 Venture into the Dungeon and Scry 1 would be nice. Or turn it into a +2 and make her ult cost much more, like make it a -8, but make this a +2. The timing would be the same, but, like, she doesn't protect herself very well with the Venture into the Dungeon. That's part of the problem. And her -2 also doesn't protect her very well because it's just like, oh, look, sometimes you find a creature. It's like if Vivian Reed, the original Vivian Reed's +1 were worse and hit fewer things. Still not a great card. Happy to see it buff, still not a great card. Fate Traversal! Look at that. They just made it cost 1 less. Doubt people will play it outside of a dungeon deck, and even in a dungeon deck, it's still kind of an awkward card. Find the Path is now able to generate 2 colors of mana instead of just a green mana, so this gets removed from being just part of, like, an awkward mono green. Maybe they want us to really play Abzan Dungeons. I'm not really sure about this card. I think this is the kind of card you can definitely include in a jankier build. And if we ever get a good, like, 3 or 4 color Venture into the Dungeon commander, right now it's like, you can run Kenrith or Kethis or something. There's no good choice for Historic Brawl for, like, a dungeon commander. At least this is better. Puppet Razor! Hey, this is another rebalanced Alchemy card. This was originally released into Alchemy, and, well, people didn't play it because it's awkward. They actually just made it have 1 extra toughness. They're like, you know what? Incremental buffs. Still not a good card, but at least it's a better card. I mean, it actually does have a very cool ability. It's just for 4 mana, a 3/3 or a 3/4. Gets kind of awkward because you have to set up your graveyard and your library for it. Very much a build around that isn't worth the build around. Precipitous Drop. This is actually huge. I ran Precipitous Drop in my Dungeons deck, and seeing it get its cost reduced is actually really big. So what's nice about Precipitous Drops? It kills a lot of different creatures. It nerfs a lot of other creatures just by making them little. Like, turning a 3/3 werewolf into a 1/1 werewolf is suddenly a lot less scary. Set you up to be able to kill it. It's -X/-X, which means it gets around Indestructible by Toski. See you later, Toski. Happy to see this. This does genuinely change how good dungeon decks are. You know what else does? Triumphant Adventurer. This was already a 1/1, which when it attacked in, had First Strike and Death Touch. It always has Death Touch. The extra power here is really big because the way that you would deal with a Triumphant Adventurer would be you'd block with 2 creatures. A 1/1 with First Strike and Death Touch kills 1 creature, and the other one kills it. Now, with 2 power, you'd need to block with 3 different things at the minimum, or your own first striking creature, in order to take this thing out. I often found that when I was using this card, and this is an absolute 4 of in my Venture into the Dungeon deck, I would always put the +1/+1 counter from the dungeon onto this card, so it would have that extra power, so it would be even harder to block and deal with. The thing just kind of keeps on going into the dungeon. Now come essentially the nerfs. Those are all buffs above there. They're calling it adjustments here. Somebody actually kind of sleuthed out what the reason for this was. Hasbro owns the Nerf company. So they don't want to call Nerf, which to Hasbro is good thing, bad thing, which is make things weaker. That Nerfs are called Nerfs, I think, in part because it's like, oh, this is the softening. We're taking the bullet and we're turning it into foam. So what is being adjusted? You're going to notice that some of the cards that are being rebalanced in Standard or banned in Standard are being rebalanced here. And cards that supported the decks that were very, very strong in Alchemy or Standard are being rebalanced here, because if they're a threat in one, they're probably a threat in the other. So, Divide by 0 only learns if it's targeting a spell or permanent with mana value 4 or less. So, if you want to hit your opponent's big, scary win con with Divide by 0 and slow your opponent down because they just sunk like 6 mana into a spell, cool, you don't get to learn. You still throw it into hand, but you don't get to learn. This is going to be a way to still interact early game, but get less interaction late game and less value late game off Divide by 0. Now, what else is there? Fearsome Whelp, the Menace. Because of this thing, you had 3 and 2 mana dragons all over the place. And it was really hard to react to it because it only costs 2 mana. And it would trigger on end step. Now it triggers on upkeep. So it is the same net effect across an entire turn, but it gives your opponent a chance to kill the Fearsome Whelp or make you discard dragons or anything like that. Fearsome Whelp did get haste, though, which is a pretty nice addition because that's either 1 extra damage to the face if you're being aggressive, or maybe like a snap, pick off a loyalty counter on a planeswalker. I think that giving it haste is kind of unnecessary. I think they could have just made it a 2 mana 1/1. But this perpetual change to the cost of dragons in hand, now happening on upkeep, does give your opponents a much better opportunity to react. And I think that that's huge. I think that that's the sort of changes that we should be seeing on these sorts of cards. Because things like Townraiser Tyrant, which you will see below, did also get affected, were just a little bit too good to get out early. And dragons typically are really strong, scary threats. Now, Holebreaker Horror had what I considered to be a double frickin' whammy on it. Holebreaker Horror had I Can't Be Countered and Flash. I Can't Be Countered is a way to avoid removal. Flash is a way to avoid removal. This thing already had a way to avoid removal when it's on the battlefield, which is that it can bounce itself back into hand by casting a spell. It is ridiculous that it had all of that text, so Holebreaker Horror now can be countered. That's only really relevant for counterspell decks. But it was so silly that this thing was like, oh, and I'd flash it out, and I have an Essence Scatter in hand. It doesn't matter if you have an Essence Scatter in hand. You can't touch my Hullbreaker Horror. Well, now it can be touched by things that aren't just kill spells, which is nice, because it's hard to hit this, and I feel like blue should have a way to answer this. I actually would have been fine also with the flash going away, but I think the fact that this is like a creature emerging from the depths, there is flavor attached to that flash that would feel bad to get rid of. Holebreaker Horror also protected itself really easily with things like Malevolent Hermit. They bring it up here, and it does get played with cards like Lier. So this way, like, your Lier will still make it uncounterable if you have one on the battlefield, and it doesn't change that much. I'd love to see cards that are big and scary kind of get brought a little bit closer to where they should be. Like, this is a fairly minor change in most matchups, but it does make a big difference in control matchups. So, like, your aggro deck, your everyday aggro deck is not running, you're not running counter spells. Doesn't make a difference. But control decks, being able to deal with each other's Hullbreaker Hordes with anything other than a kill spell in the next turn when it can already protect itself, is pretty big. Gives you a chance to react. Inquisitor Captain can no longer be chained together. What people were doing with this card is they were running cards like the is it called Glasspool Mimic? I can't remember its exact name, but it's the MDFC land and a creature is a rogue that copies a creature on the battlefield. Inquisitor Captain could be chained together because it would seek out those clone cards, clone itself, continue to seek out more clone cards, and you would end up with a pile of Inquisitor Captains on the battlefield. Inquisitor Captain is still insanely strong. Even though it says if you cast it, this is huge. This is huge, and it was so strong with blink cards. They even bring up down here that in Historic, this was really, really strong with things like Soul Herder. This card was like an extra Coco, and it's still a lot like an extra Coco. It's incredibly strong, and the fact that now blinking it won't do anything, so you can't just, like, I don't know, get your Charming Prince out and flicker it. It will no longer get you additional value. It's still a 4-mana 3/3 with Vigilance that, when you cast it, will get you another creature, though. That's still really good. It's still like a Coco that doesn't whiff, and one of the creatures is a freaking 3/3 with Vigilance. That's still good. Still a good card. Good change, though. Makes it a little less broken. Lier! Hi, Lier! This is a change that's pretty tasty. Only has flashback for the cards in your graveyard during your turn. That makes it a lot harder to protect Lier, because now he can't just be like, ha ha ha, and then that fading hope from the first turn that I have in my graveyard, I'm going to use it to bounce myself back into hand. Ah, yeah, look at that. It also means that, like, getting additional value off, like, draw cards that you had in your graveyard, not gonna happen. Lier, you're operating slightly more at sorcery speed now. Lier getting nerfed, kind of like Holebreaker Horror, is a good thing. At least if you ask me. I think it's a good thing. Sanguine Brushstroke, very minor change. No longer does sacrificing a blood token gain you a life, it just makes your opponent lose 1 life, which it already did. This is essentially a net change of 1 life on this entire card, because it typically did not see play in decks with blood. It was the only source of blood tokens in the decks I would usually see it in, with the exception of, like, Anya Brawl. Sanguine Brushstroke, though, still a very good card. Anything that gets you a copy of Blood Artist is good, and getting that extra blood token is pretty tasty too. So, very, very minor change. I don't really see this affecting the playability of this card much at all. Now, Time Razor Tyrant! This is huge! Time Razor Tyrant now can only target non-basic lands. It makes it a lot worse against monocolor aggro decks. Or just monocolored decks in general. Time Razor Tyrant's such a scary threat, especially with that Whelp. Yeah, it turns out 4-mana 4/4, already, like, that's the rate for flying dragons, big and scary, big oof. You would usually want to target non-basics anyway with this, because that way you're cutting your opponent off from multiple colors of mana, assuming it's a dual land. But this is still great, because it means that there will be situations where you will have to consider, do I want to play my Time Razor Tyrant and not target a land at all? or do I want to hold on to it and see if my opponent does? Because, like, sometimes you'll end up like, oh, I play a forest and I play a mountain, and your opponent is sitting there like, well, I can't hit either of those with the Town Raiser Tyrant. Do I want to just get the 4/4 on the battlefield? Is that good enough? The answer is probably yes. This card's very good. But it was getting just a little bit too much damage, by which I mean a lot of it too much damage. Great card. Love the design. It's really fun. I love burninating lands. Now, if you watched my video about the bans that are happening in Standard and Historic and I guess sort of Legacy, you already saw this. This does not impact Alchemy. Teferi is not in Alchemy. He is not legal in Alchemy, but he is legal in Historic, which is another live format. Teferi, Monster, Time Raveler is finally being unbanned. Now, if you just told me those words in a vacuum, Teferi, Time Raveler is being unbanned in Historic, my thought would be, but they're actually making a pretty important change to him. The change that is happening to Teferi that's super relevant is no longer is it your opponents can't cast cards at instant speed. It's your opponents can't cast spells during your turn, which means that you can kind of play out your stuff without your opponents interacting with you on your turn, but they can then use all of their cards and react to things you try to do on their turn, which is what your +1 allows you to do by casting your sorceries at instant speed. Upkeep and draw step, thought seizes and thought erasures are a big thing with Teferi, Time Raveler, and this makes them a little bit weaker because at least you can cast that card that you really need to, or use your own counterspells on your turn. Teferi, Time Raveler also is having its mana cost increased to 4 mana. You can no longer call this Teferi with a 3 instead of one of the E's. It's a Teferi, but we already have other Teferis, so the nomenclature no longer works. And has 5 loyalty to start. That's quite a bit of loyalty, and I do actually think that this is still going to be a really, really, really strong card. And I'm going to build a Brawl deck with him. I used to run this guy in like Tulane and a bunch of other blinky Brawl decks because the minus ability, you can hit your own permanents or you can hit your opponent's permanents. It's still a really good card. Its abilities are still really strong, and unless you're like playing a hard control deck, that plus won't make as big of a difference. The passive. Something else that's really big about the way that this passive is being reworded is it's going to allow for cards that cascade to work properly, and for cards that cast spells as part of their resolution. So for example, if you cast a Mizzix Mastery, it's technically casting any spells from the graveyard at instant speed, and Teferi would hose them. Ashiok from Theros Beyond Death, their -7 ability, same thing. It's technically casting the spells at instant speed, and it would hose them. Cascade. You cast a Burst Sliver, you cascade into a spell. It's technically being cast at instant speed, and it would hose them, but no longer with the new wording of Teferi, Time Raveler. You will now be able to get those essentially free spells off the stack and resolve in the way that you want them to. So here's to you, Teferi, Time Raveler. I bet you're still going to be a menace, but you're going to be less of one, and I'm going to have to test out some new Super Friends decks. You know, pair you with a couple Blinky Blanks, maybe make a second deck that's all about those board wipes and counter spells. I'm gonna unleash the evil inner Amy. And those are all the changes that are happening to the live formats in Arena. I hope that this video was helpful, and I enjoyed making it. My stream, actually, I had to take it down today because I was having internet issues, but that doesn't stop me from recording this. So cheers, and I hope to see you on my channel. That's twitch.tv/Amazonian soon.